It is the birthday of the. This week we celebrated the yard site and the birthday of the Mittler Rebbe. So
That's correct.
On this week's parsha, it says, "Vayishlach Yaakov malachim lefonov el Esav achiv." Yaakov sent forth angels, emissaries to Esav's brother. Yaakov was in fight with his brother. His brother was upset with him because he received blessings that he believed belonged to him. And he said that, which is the reason that he ran away to Lavan, his uncle, and he got married over there with Rachel and Leah, and he now had 11 children from 4 wives. And now he's coming back to the land of Israel. As we read in the end of the portion of this week of Parshas Vayishlach, Esav now had already moved outside of Israel. He didn't want to deal with getting a future inheritance in the land of Israel with what a price that meant that he had to be enslaved and subjugated to a nation that's not his own. We'll find out later that it was Egypt for hundreds of years. He would rather not deal with that, so he left the land and he went to the land of Seir. And Yaakov already has his forwarding address. He is no longer in the land of Israel. He is in the land of Seir, and he sends his messengers over there. And the question arises, why does he bother engaging with Esav altogether? Esav is not bothering him. He should just come back to Israel. His parents have not seen him for the last 20 years. Why don't you just go back to your father? Why are you bothering to deal with Esav? Engage him. And Chassidus explains.
Rabbi Keller, I just want to mention to you that someone in this class asked that question yesterday. So you're saying this question is asked by the Mittler Rebbe? Is this a question asked by the Mittler Rebbe?
The question is already raised by the Alter Rebbe, by the first Chabad Rebbe, in a discourse that he delivered in the week of on the day of Shabbos, Parshas Vayishlach, in the year 1904, which is exactly 217 years ago. And so the response...
You mean 1804? 1804.
Explains it at length. The same idea, but brings in also a discourse that he had delivered the previous year, which is on the continuation of begins with the words of the conversation that Yaakov has with his brother Esav in Lavan Garti. I have lived with Lavan, and I've been late till now. And over there also he raises certain questions. So, and Rashi brings down, what does it mean in Lavan Garti, I dwelt with Lavan? Why is it so important, number A, to let us know that he dwelt with Lavan? Why is Esav so interested who he lives with? And also, why does he use such an unusual language? Usually we would say Yashafti, expect Yashafti, and Rashi brings from the Medrash, Garti is the numerical value of 613. Garti is the same letters as Taryag, 613. He's telling him that although I was by Lavan, which is not a natural atmosphere to do Torah mitzvahs, I kept to all 613 commandments. And so, but right afterwards, he says, and I had sheep and a ox and a donkey and sheep and a slave and a maidservant. Why is that important to Esav? Especially, we all know how Esav was upset at blessings that that Yaakov had received from Yitzchak, and he thought that they were rightfully his because Yitzchak had offered them to Esav. Esav being the older brother. So this is the first thing that you're pointing out, that you had all these nice blessings that Yitzchak gave you. So the Mittler Rebbe says, to understand that, we have to understand what Yaakov was doing with Lavan. At first glance, it seems, listen, Yaakov needed a job. He's getting married, and we know when a Jewish person gets married, he writes a marriage contract. And in the marriage contract, he takes upon himself, I will provide not only for her emotional needs, not only for the intercourse, which is the relationship between the man and the woman, but I take upon myself the responsibility to provide for her livelihood. This is a responsibility that Yaakov took upon himself. So he had to go out and work. And the method of employment that he found by Lavan was working for his sheep. Lavan had many sheep. Lavan was already at the stage, I'm marrying off already my daughter. Till now, my daughters, they were living in my house. I made sure they worked. But now that I'm marrying off the daughters, it's going to be your responsibility. And I'm willing to pay. And he did pay. And so it's all about negotiating the price. What Yaakov is charging him for what a work. But Hasidus tells us it's much more than that. Lavan has not only a negative connotation to him, it's not only Lavan, the swindler, but Lavan represents the color white. And white represents the oneness of God. We know nowadays we go to school and we're taught that there are three basic colors. There's color red and the color blue, and in between there's green. But Hasidus tells us no. There's really one basic color, white. If you take white and you put it through a prism, so at one end of the spectrum you'll have red, at the other end of the spectrum you'll have blue, and somewhere in between you'll have either green or yellow. But that's just the division. When you have number one and you have a million, right? So one might think, oh, the number million is so important. But we know once Einstein, we already had the 104 elements or so on and so forth, what Einstein perceived and kind of eluded him was the unified theory. We're looking to the oneness that must precede all division. So the same, I think it says the same thing is in colors, just like God is complete unity, likewise in colors. White is the basic color because that's the color that includes everything, so much so that when you break it down under a prism, you can find one. If you take different colors and different ends of the spectrum, the middle and the beginning and the end, and you put them one on top of each other, you'll come up with the color white. Because then you'll find the totality. So the totality is much more than its division, than a sum of the division. So this is what love represents. Love represents the will. We all know numerical system is based on value 10.
Rabbi Keller, I just want to interrupt you for 1 second. Rabbi Keller?
Why is the numerical system based on value 10? We know we have
Rabbi Keller.
Then from 10 we multiply by 20, 30, 40, all the way to 100. And once we have 100, we go 100, 200, 300, all the way to 1,000. And this is basically
Rabbi Keller.
the numerical system kind of ends. Yes, we do have a number of million, but a million is really 1,000 times 1,000.
Rabbi Keller.
Repeat the operation and it's called a billion. Do it 3 times, it's called a trillion. But really, in all numbers, in all numerical systems, that's where numbers end.
Rabbi Keller?
One language, in the language Hebrew, after the number 1,000, we have what in English we refer to as myriads, which is 10,000, and that's because we have a Hebrew word at that point, which is
might have to call him
10,000. And the reason that the numerical system is based on value 10 rather than value 8 or 9 or 7, so technically we can say, well, one counts by his fingers and one has 10 fingers. So whether you count by the fingers of your talus or you count by the fingers of your hands. But really, that's very technical because really God created us and he created us with 10 fingers because he wanted the numerical system to be based on value 10. Comes Hasidus and says that everything that happens in the world involves intellect and emotions. Usually people are drawn to something because they love it. People like ice cream because it tastes good. So there's emotions involved. And in emotions, there's basically 7 emotions and methods and 3 intellects. You know, Chabad is an acronym. Chochma, Bina, Das. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Rabbi Keller?
And
Rabbi Keller,
those are the
can you hear me?
3 intellectual properties. And the 7 emotional properties are the 3 primary emotions: kindness, restraint, and compassion. And then we have the methods. Persistence, for instance. Let's say during a person's prayer to God, he's interacting with God, he's trying to concentrate why he should love God. Or, to the contrary, he focuses on the fact how distant we are from God, which creates within him the emotion of awe. Wow, I'm in awe of God. I tremble before God. And then there's the level of compassion where awe and love are both equal. In other words, because I love somebody, I want to give to him. Because I am in awe, I say, no, I don't deserve it. As a receiver, I say, I don't deserve all of that. I would like to go close, but I should keep my distance to show my respect. And compassion is somewhere in between, which says, yes, I might not deserve it, but still, in addition to being our king, you're also our father, so you should give us. But that's when we're interacting with God. But throughout the day, we are busy engaging in other things. And that's where persistence comes in. That even while I'm engaged in other things, I should still act consistent with that tremendous love that I had for God, that I had around while I was engaged in it. And then there's acknowledgement. Persistence is for things that I can relate to. But now I happen to be not engaged and delving deeply into it. However, what about things that are so beyond me that I can't even grasp them, but yet I know there's much more to the relationship. Usually we talk, but sometimes we're so happy we go out and dance and we sing. And then the communication. Once we have all these emotions and methods, we want to share it with others who are not yet on that level. And then finally, these 6 are masculine, just like in intellect. There's wisdom and understanding. Wisdom is masculine. The idea to come up with an idea, with whether it's coming up with the idea of relativity or other ideas, that's masculine. But to take an idea and analyze it from all angles, that's feminine. Likewise, the arousal of emotions is masculine, and to execute the emotions. Imagine a husband comes home to his wife and he says, I saw this person and it's a pity on him, and he starts to describe what a pity it is about that person. And so say, cut to the chase, just tell me whether we should offer him food or money, or maybe he needs a job. Because the difference between intellect and emotions is intellect. One can sit and contemplate all day long whether the sun revolves around the earth or the earth around the sun. But for that, we don't need a different entity, but emotions is interacting with others. So the arousal of emotions per se doesn't give anything to the person who is being impacted. When you start talking with him, that's when you're communicating with him, and that's where royalty comes in. Royalty gives place for the actual other with whom you interact. So this is what the number 10 represents. So Yaakov in white represents the number 1, which supersedes the 10, which is the source of the 10. And from there we get into 10 and 100 and 1,000. And all these things, that was what Yaakov did with Lavan. Now he's coming to Esav. Why does he want to engage Esav? Because throughout that time, he drew down different levels of godliness. But in order to bring redemption in the world, which was the objective of Yaakov, you have to share it with the entire world. And over here, the energy of Esav comes in. Why was it that Yitzchak, Isaac, knew that Yaakov is always mentioning God's name, and yet he did not want to give Yaakov the blessings, and he wanted to give it to Esau. The reason he wanted to give it to Esau, because Yaakov was already engaging with godly affairs. That's very good for people who love to learn. You know how many you have? Maybe 10%. But the other 90% are people who are not interested in learning. They're interested in making sure that they have food on the table, they have where to sleep, they're able to entertain themselves, entertain others. And that's where Yitzchak's work comes in. Yitzchak, unlike Avraham, who was shutting down godliness from above, Yitzchak was digging wells. His main service, his main work was digging wells. When you dig wells, you're digging deep within the person himself. Just like when you dig with the earth, you're not bringing water from some external place, but within the earth itself, there's all water, ready water. All you have to do is uncover the earth, which is covering it. This is the same message that Yitzchak had to each and every person. Deep within yourself, you have a well of goodness and kindness that God has planted over there. And all you have to do is uncover the selfishness, which covers it up and which brings about also laziness. And when you uncover that wealth, you can tap in and see how doing goodness and kindness will bring, when you realize it's not only executing God's wishes, but it improves your own lot. When you dig for oil, so you find the oil, instead of importing it from Saudi Arabia, you'll find it here in America, and you can even export it, and so on and so forth. Then you'll do good things with your time. And this is what he wanted Esav. There were two types of energy. There was an energy in which the 10 spheres of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, each of these spheres was very, very strong and very powerful. In the original world of chaos, there was very strong wisdom and very strong understanding that was not tempered down by, you see, the way Yaakov works, there's a word of Atzilus, of God's emotions, where within kindness you have kindness and restraint and compassion. So kindness is not undiluted kindness. Everything is diluted because kindness also has within itself restraint. You have children and you want to take them out to Disneyland, but you'll take them out to Disneyland, they'll go bonkers. So you say, no, you have to, if you have a small kid, sometimes you'll hold him with a harness to make sure he doesn't go too far, because who knows where the kid is going to get lost, know how to go. But Esav, it comes from a very high energy in which wisdom, you can take pure wisdom and it remains on course. You can take pure restraint. Everything is in its purest form. The dilemma with it is that everything clashes. There is nothing to keep them, to coordinate them. And this is where Yaakov says, if we take my vessels of coordination with your high energy, together we can bring the redemption. And this is what Yaakov is approaching Esau. And he sends messengers. And he says, what do I have? I have an ox and a donkey and sheep and slave and a handmaiden. And these represent the 5 levels of holiness. And he says what happens is, we all know that there's not only levels of holiness, but it's also levels of selfishness. And so he says like this. We all know, on the one hand, there's an ox, and on the other hand, there's a sheep. A sheep represents kindness. A sheep is quiet. He's not aggressive at all. And he's very pleasant to be around. He gives milk. The dilemma with having only sheep is, if you have a field, and the old days, the way you plowed the field was with an ox. An ox you can harness to a yoke, and the ox will plow the field. It will thresh the field. The sheep is very quiet, not aggressive, very nice and good. But the downside is that he doesn't do any work. So The point of the ox is that it shows that if you can harness the ox, wow, can it produce work for you. And this is what Yaakov said. While I was with Lavan, yes, I worked with the sheep, but I exchanged some of the sheep for ox, and I harnessed the ox, that even the ox could be utilized for goodness and kindness. So even you, Esav, you like to have a good time. Even that you can harness it, because I've learned to work with all the ox, with the donkey, and with the sheep, and with a servant and maidservant, and now we have all the ingredients, and all we have to do is work together. So what did the messengers come back to Yaakov, and they say, yes, we came to your brother Esav, however, he took 400 men with him, and he's coming to attack you. What do these 400 men represent? Chassidus says these 400 men, they come from a very holy place. Where do we have the number 400 earlier? We had it a few weeks ago when Avram bought the Ma'aras Machpelah, the cave of the double structure. And how much did he pay for it? 400 shekel. Every shekel is a half ounce. So for a total of 200 ounces of silver. What was so significant of the number 400? The word silver, the Hebrew word for silver, kesef, represents yearning. As we find last week when Yaakov leaves Lavan, and he says, you yearned to join your father's house. You're homesick. I understand that. So love, the 400 words of love, those 400 words of love, but when they came to Esav, what is the difference between Esav and Yaakov? Yaakov is the epitome of kindness, gentle. When he tells his father, would you sit? He says, please sit. God has provided for me. Esav is rough and gruff. Come, get up. That's what we call blunt, direct. Doesn't beat around the bush. And the 400 men of Esav were aggressive, ready to fight war as if the whole world is against them. That's the dilemma. And Yaakov, the Mittler Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe discusses, and the Mittler Rebbe is going to discuss in great detail, Yaakov is treating Esav on both levels. On one level, there's very high energies, which he wants to harness. He wants to receive from Jacob, from Esav. He wants to receive from Esav his high energies, his chaotic energies, because once Yaakov deals with it, it shall no longer be chaotic. On the other hand, he wants to give to Esav. And we'll find that after the presents, we'll go in a different time, we'll discuss all the presents. He bows down 7 times to Esav. What is it? And before he bows, and after he bows down to Esav, what do we find? That Esav embraces Yaakov and he kisses him. In general, if we look in the Sefer Torah, we usually have the letters, 304,000 letters and change, and then we have on certain letters we have crowns. We all know on the letters Shin, Ayin, Tes, Nun, Zayin, Gimel, and Tzadik. We have crowns, 3 short crowns, and then we have mostly the nekudos is what we call vowels. They are not pronounced, and they're only there in a chumash, and otherwise we know them by heart. But in the Sefer Torah, they're not there. But here and there are certain letters upon which there are dots. And we know that the dots come to weaken it. And to say, for instance, usually that's why there's an argument regarding the kissing of Esav, because there are dots on the word Vayishakeu. When it comes Vayichapkeu, and he embraced him, there are no dots. All of a sudden, by the words Vayishakeu, there are dots. And what do the dots represent? Rashi brings 2 opinions. One opinion is, Vayishakeu, the dots come to say that he didn't kiss him from the depth of his heart. It was an external kiss. Sometimes you'll get a kiss, it's called a kiss because you're expected to kiss. He didn't really come from within the heart of Esav. But then Rashi brings the other opinion. Rashi says, no, Esav kissed him with his entire heart. So why is there dots? Because usually we have a halacha, Esav hates Yaakov. That's the way God construed Esav, that Esav hates Yaakov, and only when Mashiach comes will it be rectified. So, and it says he kissed him, meaning Esav kiss, an Esav kiss is not a correct kiss. So if we weaken the Esav kiss, it means that it was a real kiss. So, and then Rebbe raises the question, wait, I don't understand. When it comes to embracing, there are no dots over there. There's nothing weakened, no arguments. Everybody agrees that the embracing was a total embrace. And as Rashi interprets, brings from the Medrash, that at that time, Esav all of a sudden had compassion on Yaakov. He didn't see him. He missed his brother 20 years. Yes, I got into a fight. I got into a skirmish. But first of all, Esav has been older, wiser, more settled down. His kids are older. He can't play with the kids. He has to start thinking about how he helps them provide for their own families. And second of all, within Esav there is good. So the first natural reaction is to embrace him. But why, when it comes to kissing, all of a sudden there are arguments? Maybe he doesn't. And the Rebbe explains the difference between embracing and kissing. When you embrace someone, it's for one moment. It's the moment of the embrace. But a kissing comes from a much deeper place. So he said, yes, we know Esav was able to embrace him. But was he able to kiss him, to really care about him and really be so happy that he finally gets to meet Yaakov? Yes, he kissed him. But did he kiss him from the depth of his heart or not? And the Mittler Rebbe says that regardless whether there was a level in which Yaakov was trying to receive from Esav, obviously from his tremendous lights, and there was a part in which Yaakov wanted to contribute to Esav, because Esav made up in life, it was lacking in vessels. The difference between the vessels of Yaakov, of Atzilus, a complete vessel is one that can get the entirety of wisdom, because within wisdom there is also understanding and also knowledge and also kindness and also restraint. The truth of a number is that it has the entire color. The truth of white is that you can see in the white, the blue and the red and the green. If you cannot see in the white, the blue and the red and the green, you can only see white, something is missing. And that was Esav's problem. Esav, when he saw white, he saw only white. He couldn't see in blue, red. He couldn't see in red, blue. So as far as vessels, the energy was unbelievable from the energy Yaakov wanted to receive. But when it comes to vessels, he could contribute. And that's why Yaakov is offering Esav. He's offering him camels and sheep. He says a present. And Esav says, no, I have plenty. Yaakov says, yes, I know you have plenty, and I want to take some from that stuff that you have. But you're also missing something, and this is what I want to contribute. And he saw that Esav wasn't getting it, and that's why when Esav says, let us travel together, he says, yes, we shall travel together, but I see you're not yet up to it. My children, they'll be able to give you even at your state, but I am not up to it, and we'll have to wait for another time. So we are going to finish just with one basic.
Rabbi Keller.
And that's
Rabbi
why
Keller.
Yaakov bowed down 7 times. Why did he bow down 7 times? So we mentioned there is the letters. The letters represent the last emotion, the one of royalty, of actually executing the emotions and interacting with somebody. The crowns that are on top of the letters, they represent the emotions. The vowels, and to the same degree, the points, the dots that we have on top of the Torah, which we have very few letters that are dotted, but one of those letters is this word, and he kissed him. That represents understanding. So we know God's name. How do you write God's name? You write Yud K Vav K, a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey. But every letter has a filling. What is the filling of Yud, the Vav and the Dalet? There's a Yud. If it was just the Yud of the Yud, it has a Y sound, but it doesn't have a word representing it. But the rest of the word, the Vav and the Dalet, that's the filling. So the Yud, there's only one way it can be filled. But the Hey and the Vav, there's different ways we can spell it. We can spell it Hey Aleph, and every spelling represents a different level. They're known as Ma, Ban, Ab, and Sag. So the vowels represent the third level. We have the lowest level is, which is from bottom up, it's the lowest level is the letters, which represent royalty, executing, where the other already exists, has a format, the letters of speech or even the letters of thought. Then you have the crowns on top of certain letters. They represent the emotions. There are already less of them, but there's still much more than the dots. The dots represent understanding, and the tune, which is absolutely not represented in any, it's not represented in any writing in the scroll, that represents wisdom. So Yaakov was trying to get from those levels of understanding that Esav had, a very strong one. And understanding is a source for the emotions, for the 7 emotions. And that's why he bowed down 7 times. Every time he bowed down to Esav, he received one more of the level of the emotions which he was trying to get from him. And finally they cried. And what did they cry over? They cried over the destruction of the Base of Mikdash. And that's a different, because the Mittler Rebbe raises the question, why would he cry over it? Who destroyed the Base of Mikdash? The first one was destroyed through some foreign country, somebody from the tribe of Cham, the one Esav killed. But the second Base of Mikdash was destroyed through Esav himself. And that's a discussion for a different time.
Rabbi Keller, this was unbelievable. You're doing amazing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Rabbi Keller?
What did you say?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
I hear you. You hear me?
Okay. Yeah, so Rabbi Keller, this was really amazing, very Kabbalistic and very insightful. The thing is, a lot of people, we had questions along the way, and you were not.
So let's
let's
address some of the questions if we have time.
But the thing is, we don't have time for questions, so unfortunately, we lost out that. But we want to ask you some questions about being a librarian in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's library. We want to find out a little about that. So maybe you could tell us, like, how many books are there, and what are the earliest, some of the earliest prints that are, really unique and that they have there, and maybe Isaac, I think Isaac has some questions as well. So maybe you could tell us a little about that.
How did you get started?
Okay. The first question is how I got started. In other words, how did I get access to the Rebbe's library? By now, everybody can get access to the Rebbe's library to a degree, meaning you can come and request up to 5 books, and there's a catalog, so you can look up at the catalog and see what you're looking for. This is as far as the printed books is concerned. As far as the manuscripts are concerned, especially since a lot of the manuscripts are dealing with the Rebbe's writings, which Lubavitch itself publishes. So yes, there is an institute that is, their job is to publish, and you can't even request those manuscripts. Here and there, if you have a manuscript, let's say from Rabbi Kiva Eger or some other scholar, you can submit a written request, and if the chief librarian will decide, okay, they'll grant you the permission, give you the photocopies of it. But how many, regarding a question that Rabbi Smith asked, how many books there are at the time when I was working in the library, which is 20 years ago, and they always get more and more books, but there was 300,000, I'm not sure if it was entries or volumes. Some entry, for instance, the Talmud could contain 20 volumes, but I believe it was 300,000 volumes, which is a lot. When it sounds okay, it's a 3 followed with 9 digits, no, but when you actually count them up, I mean, so much so we have a whole room full of printed books, and but there's not much space between each shelf. There are a whole bunch of shelves packed. So when you have to roll. There's a roller, a professional roller, which will roll. Let's say section 1 will cover Chumash. Section 2 is the commentaries of Chumash. Section 3 is Navi, the prophets. Section 4 would be the Mishnah, and Section 5 would be the Talmud. I believe section 5 would be the commentaries on the Mishnah, and section 6 would be the Talmud, section 7 would be the commentaries on Talmud, and so on and so forth. So that was the collection of the previous Rebbe. When the Rebbe became Rebbe, he had his own collection. For many years, it was Reb Chaim Lieberman who was in charge of the previous Rebbe's collection, and only after there was a court case about the books that the entire was there a unification of both parts of the library. So by now there's about 100 different categories. There was the magazines, and there was the books, the Sfarim of halacha books, and books on the Talmud, and Sidurim, and Machzorim, and history books. And then the Rebbe's library, which started off as the Merkez library, which is the center of education that had their own library. Altogether, by now, there's 300,000 books. The way I got access many, many years ago is because it just so happens to be that my uncle is the chief librarian by God's providence. So initially, I worked as an eighth grader on certain days when I was in between classes, because I was able to, I studied at home. So sometimes I was able to finish the school material earlier, and he would allow me in. But more so when I graduated the rabbinical college, and I was always fascinated because they would print from the manuscripts of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe said this Maimer Vayishlach. I believe this Maimer Vayishlach was said in the year Tov Kuf Pei Gimel, which, because it's kislev, it would translate to the year 1822. But in those years, they started printing a lot of the volumes of the Alter Rebbe's Memorim. And I would do research because, so this Maimer was said this year, and that Maimer was said that year, and there were Memorim that were not dated. And from certain Memorim, we would have more than one person who would write it down. Obviously, the Mittler Rebbe wrote it down. But the most famous person who wrote down the Alter Rebbe's Memorim was his brother, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, known also in the acronym Maharil. Maharil means Vayreinu Harav Rabbi Yehuda Leib. The Maharil was famous, not only that, but the Alter Rebbe actually paid his brother, the Maharil, to write down his Torahs, because originally the Alter Rebbe used to speak once a month. So once a month, yes, he used to. Initially, the Maharil spent all his years, a good few years, he spelled in Li Ojni before even the Alter Rebbe. What happened was the Alter Rebbe was arrested because of complaints that were lodged against him about people who had political disagreements with him and whatnot, and also ideological disagreements. And at some point, Li Ojni was a very small town, so much so that one year it couldn't handle so many people, and it broke. So and eventually the Alter Rebbe said, you can't come for Shavuos. Shavuos was the time when everybody could come, because after all, Pesach, many people stay home. Tishrei, many people stay home. But Shavuos, more people can come. And Shavuos was packed. It was jam-packed. There was not enough room, and it broke. So the Alter Rebbe said, don't come for Shavuos the last few years. But then the Alter Rebbe, after the second time he was arrested, he moved to a bigger town, to Liadi. And over there was room for everybody. So anyways, there was writings down that the Maharil wrote down, and Reb Moshe, another son of the Alter Rebbe, who also wrote down. And there was a time that we believed that when the Tzemach Tzedek, that's the third Chabad Rebbe, when he published the discourses of the Alter Rebbe in Torah Or and Likutei Torah, each and every one of them is the Anoch of the Maharil. But upon further examination, especially after they started printing a lot of the other Hanochas, the other writings down of the Mittler Rebbe and Reb Moshe and Pinchas, and when I did comparison, and it seemed no, a lot of times the Tzemach Tzedek, for instance, in the Maimer Vayishlach, the one printed in Torah Or is a combination of the writings of Reb Moshe, the younger son of the Alter Rebbe, of the first Chabad Rebbe, and the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe, who was the oldest son. And he combined it all to write his own version. So I did a lot of research, and eventually at some point they said, why do you have to sit outside the library trying to figure it all out? We'll give you access, and you can actually help us because we're now preparing for print the last 2 years that we have the last 2 complete years that the Alter Rebbe spent in Liadi were the equivalent of the year 1811 and 1812. As a matter of fact, the last few months of 1812, that's when Napoleon's War broke out, and the Alter Rebbe didn't want to be under Napoleon, not even for 1 minute. So he moved out of there, and I did I assisted them in combining all the information that I was able to figure out about it, and that's when I started. Then I was asked to compile a list of the Tzemach Tzedek Somarim based obviously on lists that they made. I had to look up the manuscripts, and from there I continued working a good few years for the Rebbe's library, then until I started working on my own.
Have all of the handwritten manuscripts been printed?
So most of it. From the Alter Rebbe, almost everything we have in Alter Rebbe writing, what happened was, just because we had a certain amount of books. Now, how many volumes do we actually have? The Mittler Rebbe describes that have written down approximately 15 years worth of the Alter Rebbe's Mamorim, over 15 years. So from those 15 years, there are the years before Peterburg, which is definitely 4 years covered, and we have 2 of those books. And there's at least one more book that we don't really have his handwriting, but some of it we have copies, and some of it we don't even have. But then from the following, the last 11 years, from the year of Tafkuf Samach Beis, 5,562, which starts at the end of 1801, and all the way till Tafkuf Ayin Beis, which is towards the end of 1812. For those 11 years, there are some years that we have the actual handwriting of the Mittler Rebbe, a few volumes in our library, and half of one particular volume is still in Russia. And on the remainder of pages, what happened was sometimes that the Mittler Rebbe would prepare, 300 pages that he was going to write, and in the middle, some very exciting event happened. All of a sudden, a particular daughter of the Mittler Rebbe got married, and he was so excited because even though it was an Einikel, the grandchild of the Berditchever, and it wasn't the first daughter that he married off to a grandchild of the Berditchever, but the first granddaughter he married off to a grandchild of the Berditchever, it was right after Shavuos. So if it was right after Shavuos, the Berditchever would never make it within 1 week all the way to Liadi, even though usually you make it in the place of the bride. So they made up that they were going to meet in the middle in Shlovin. It's known as the famous Shlovin Chasana. But the second wedding took place in Liadi, and the Mittler Rebbe was so happy, he said, okay, we're starting a new book. The explanation of Shabbos on the discourse. He wrote, it's very interesting, but because you would expect, the Alter Rebbe sometimes would say not only a discourse, but he would say explanation. And you would expect that he should first write down the discourse and then the explanation. But the explanation was more, was much fresher in his mind. So first thing, he would write down the explanation. Obviously, he would give a few pages space, and that's, Mittler Rebbe was able to calculate how much pages he needs to leave empty so he can fill it in. And he starts writing the explanation. And in the middle of writing the explanation, he becomes so excited, he says, okay, this calls for a new book. He takes a new book that had been prepared, for the next, for when he finishes this. And in the new book, he starts continuing the explanation from where he left off. And he also gives the mimer itself. And now that Tzemach Tzedek doesn't, like, one thing that Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, had in common with our present Rebbe is they don't leave one paper wasted. So all these pages, he gets to write a lot of his explanations and things. So the end of that particular volume, but there are volumes that we only have copies of. And so there was this one volume that of copies that from the Mittler Rebbe's Hanacha that we only got, we bought it, somebody bought it for the library a few years ago. So they managed to print a few of the Mamorim, but not all of them. So we have some Amorim that were not printed, but most of the Amorim of the Alter Rebbe were printed. If not this Hanocha, a different Hanocha. And then from the Mittler Rebbe, most of it was printed. They're now going to print from a particular year. They're preparing for print from the Rebbe Rashab. When the Rebbe Marash, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, the last year, Tafresh and Beis, which is the equivalent of the year 1881, the beginning of 1881 and the end of 1881 and most of 1882. And so we had printed the Mamorim, the discourses of the Rebbe Marash, but now we found a book in Russia also, a book of the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Marash's son, who wrote down the way he heard from his father. And they're preparing it for print, and anybody who wants to give money towards it, so people can get together and contact the administration of the library and see, I'm sure if there's a certain amount of money, they can assist in the publication. I know they're working on publishing this and also other, both writings in the Mittler Rebbe also wrote Nigla. They're preparing now for print the Mittler Rebbe's writings in the field of treifas, of kosher food, and also regards marriage and divorce, and they're working now on the index, and Amrit Hashem, God willing, it will be published.
So tell us a little maybe about like the old volumes that, like from the earliest prints, like what would you say is like the most unique?
So the earliest prints that we have, we know the earliest prints that Jewish print is approximately the year 1473. Approximately that year was the earliest print that we know in Italy. But the first one that the printer actually wrote the year in which was printed is a copy of Rashi on Chumash.
Uh-huh.
I believe from that first print, we don't have the copy there's a copy that's available somewhere that has most of the Chumash. It's been reprinted from it. It's available in the Hebrew, the Jerusalem manuscript and Jerusalem library, where they have photocopies of all the early prints. But we do have a few pages of it in the Rebbe's library. There's also some prints that in Spain, before 1492, they managed to print 20 volumes of Talmud, a volume of Rashi's commentary on Chumash, and other volumes. We have some of those, some pages of those, not the whole volumes. We do have early prints of the Radak, Reb David Kimchi. He has Ralbag, Reb Levi Ben Gershom has a commentary on Chumash. We have some of the early prints of the Ramban's commentary on Chumash. So yeah, the earliest prints that we have are from about 540 years ago, approximately. We also have manuscripts. Both manuscripts. We have some manuscripts even from I would say from 600 years ago or 650 years ago. There's a very interesting book called Orchos Chaim, which was written by Reb Aaron HaKohen, who's originally of Lunel in France, in southern France, which is known as Provence, and then he emigrated to Mallorca, which is, I think, some island off Morocco or something. And that was because they were exiled from France. They were banished from France, not once, but many times, because after a while they would realize, okay, without the Jews, there's no money coming in. So they would allow them little by little back in. But this would have been in the year 1306. And that's when he left Lunel and he went to Mallorca. So there's a few editions of his book, handwriting, and we have quite a few pages that we received from somewhere. But we have many more manuscripts from the Rebbes themselves, whether it's the Baal Shem Tov, some certain letters we have from the Baal Shem Tov. We have a lot of handwriting from the Alter Rebbe, but more so from the Mittler Rebbe. His Torah that was written down, whether by the Alter Rebbe or the Alter Rebbe's brother, or the Mittler Rebbe, or Moshe, or Pinchas. Some of it his own handwriting, some of it a copy that was copied by somebody, a whole book of his. So yeah, we have a whole bunch of those.
Would you see?
What was the biggest surprise that was found when it was found? I mean, was there anything there that was argued over and suddenly it was a surprise that it was found or anything?
Okay, so when we knew, we kind of knew that the previous Rebbe had acquired the Siddur of the Baal Shem Tov. There was even a time somewhere, I think in the 1905 or 1906, when the previous Rebbe allowed for certain people to see it, and the only precondition was that you had gone to the mikveh. Not many people used to go there on a regular Monday to the mikveh. So, but people who went to the mikveh were able to. But afterwards, the Rebbe made a whole, when they started stealing his farm, the Rebbe said they even wanted to get their hands on the Siddur of the Baal Shem Tov. And this is a Siddur from which the Baal Shem Tov prayed. It was written with the explanations of the Arizal, in which he says what you have to have in mind while you're davening, which obviously only great Kabbalists can understand. But different people, different students of the Baal Shem Tov wrote their names with their mother's names, so the Baal Shem Tov should daven for them. And in some places, even a tear from the Baal Shem Tov, or maybe even some blood that dripped from some part of the Baal Shem Tov's body, a drop of blood. So yes, we have that. That was, but for us Chassidim, the main manuscripts are the manuscripts from which of Chassidus, with Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. We also have a famous Kabbalist, Reb Nachum Azaria of Panu, of Italy, who was a famous Kabbalist, and we have his own handwriting in one of the volumes of Kanfa Yoina. We also have Reb Shmuel Vital, who was the son of Reb Chaim Vital, the famous Shmoyne Shorim from the 8 gates. We have one of the gates which was actually the actual handwriting of Reb Shmuel Vital, and we also have the actual handwriting of Reb Moshe Kardabiro of Or Yakar. We have, I believe, one volume in the actual handwriting of Reb Moshe Kardabiro, I believe. I'm not sure if they were all copies or some of them are the actual handwriting of the Reb Moshe Kardabiro. So we do have, and those were bought by the Rebbe's shop when they were up for sale 100 years ago, 120 years ago.
Would you see the Rebbe going into the library and spending hours and hours looking through different Sfarim?
You see, one thing that we had with the Rebbe was we had this relationship of, at the same time that we loved the Rebbe, we also kept our distance from the Rebbe. We didn't walk over to the Rebbe's hand and kiss it. We would make sure when the Rebbe would come, we would part for Amos. So much so, in the early years, even though 770 was only upstairs 770 and there was not much space and there was pushing going on during Mafter, but the space immediately before the Rebbe, everybody stayed away from, because that's and so when the Rebbe was in the library, only the chief librarian was there with him. I wasn't there, besides for the fact that at the time I did not work in the library. But even at the time when I did work in the library, when the Rebbe was not feeling well, and there was a time that they brought him to the library so he could see the books, obviously at that time I was not in the library.
What was the name of the chief librarian? Was it Ber Levin?
So the name of the chief librarian is Ber Levin. He's still alive. He's still the chief librarian. He was appointed by the Rebbe to become chief librarian in the year 1977. In the year 1976, the Rebbe, at the end of the summer, the Chai El Fabrengen, the Rebbe said he wanted that booklets should be published by the Koilel, by the young Galite who was studying in the Koilel. And my uncle, who had studied in the Koilel, he had just got married 2 years earlier. He had already started preparing stuff from the Chassidim and the Alter Rebbe, and he submitted it. And the Rebbe said, okay, you're hired. And he loved his work so much so, he said, I need somebody to manage the library. I'm hiring you specifically for that. So he's the chief librarian. Under him, there's Rabbi Yitzchak Willel. There's a staff who help people get books from the library. There's his son, Zalman Levin. Staff of those who are working on the manuscripts with the manuscripts are Reb Elia Matasov, Reb Zisel Pikarski, and Gabriel Shapiro. And there was, of course, Reb Ara Lechitrik, who, while he was alive, he was the head of the Institute publishing. He would sign off on the hours that they worked. All the people who worked before Rabbi Chodakov would give the check, or Rabbi Krinsky later. It was Rabbi Chitrik signing off. He had passed away approximately 10 or 11 years ago.
of all the, I mean, I'm sure you've seen not libraries, but manuscripts from a lot of different sources. But after working so long with the library and the manuscripts and the thoughts, who would you say is the closest Hasidic group to Lubavitch? Who came along with similar lines of thought in terms of Hasidus? Not exactly the same, of course, but who would you say is, the closest one that didn't quite make it to Lubavitch?
Okay. Over the years, we had close relationships with a lot, but like we had a very close relationship with Ger, and Reb Scholz, Alta's father, the Pinchas Menachem, and the present Ger Rebbe, Rabbi Yankel. They both came to the Rebbe, but the one we had the most personal connection over the years was Amshinov and Karlin. Amshinov was close. The Rebbe Reb Shimele was close to the Frierdiker Rebbe in Atvotsk. So much so when after the Nazi invasion, and the Rebbe said that the Bochum should go to Vilna, and they asked, we'll have questions of life and death. Who should we follow? And the Rebbe said, we have the Reb Shimele, the Amshinover Rebbe, follow him. And the Amshinover also got involved. When the beginning, the Rebbe became Rebbe, and the Rishag wasn't exactly joining the Rebbe by davening or by verbringen, and the Amshinover went and made sure that everything was smoothed out. So Amshinov was very close. We always remain close with Amshinov till this day. Also, the Karlin, especially when Rabbi Yochanan had passed away, and the present Karlin Rebbe, the stolen Rebbe, was a young boy, and not many people supported him. And a whole bunch of people went to Lelev, and we were close with Lelev also. As a matter of fact, one of the Lelev Rebbes, Reb Shimele, had settled in Crown Heights when his grandfather was Rebbe, and he had settled in Crown Heights for many years because his father-in-law lived in Crown Heights, So the Skolene Rebbe was very close. He used to sit by the Rebbe's Verbringens. So different. We were very close with different Rebbes, but I would say the Stoliner, the Rebbe had a very special connection with the Stoliner, so much so when a particular chassid came to our Rebbe and his Stoliner chassid, and the Rebbe told him, "Why are you going here? You have your Rebbe in the present Stoliner Rebbe. You should go." Which the Rebbe never said. Usually, even other chassidim who came, the Rebbe would ask the Rebbe for brachas or whatnot. The Rebbe would say, but the Rebbe wanted to make a point that they should know. We were also very close with Slonim. Slonim over the years became very close with the Rebbe. The second Slonim Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, was very close with the Rebbe Rashab. He actually sent one of his students, who became later Rosh Yeshiva in Bayos, a big Rabbi Kastel, and his grandson, of course, runs the Tzach. And his son ran the yeshiva in Boston, and he himself was many, many years teaching in 770. So he was one of the Bochrim that Reb Shmuel had sent specifically to learn in Lubavitch. He said, "You belong in Lubavitch."
Are there any other libraries?
I remember as a Bocher, before I just want to mention, I remember as a Bocher, I studied in Teda Semes at the time. I was a young boy of I was 13 at the time when the Slonim Rebbe Zechayil Levrach had passed away, and it was 1981, right after Shavuos, and the Rebbe had sent a directive that the yeshiva bochrim should be at the Levaya. So continue. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if there's any other libraries that you think could compare in Jewish books. In the world, in manuscripts and so on, like where else would you find such?
Before I want to address, I missed mentioning the Rebbe was also very close with bells, especially with the old bells there. So much so that he had told during the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, when Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Herzog was visiting, and he was talking about Gedolim, and the Rebbe said that there are only two Gedolim in our generation. There's my father-in-law, and there's the Belzerov. So that's how close we were with the previous Belzer Rebbe. Regarding libraries, there's the JTS, which used to be for many, many years. It was in Manhattan. It was on 122nd and Broadway. I went down there quite a few times. I know even Rabbi Chitzig might have gone down there once or twice. But I think recently they moved to Jersey or something. But a few years ago, I don't know why, they decided there's a famous librarian over there in the manuscript department, Rabbi Schwartzberg, who had studied, I think, maybe a little time in Lubavitcher, but then studied maybe in Teravadas or something. But we all know the Jerusalem Library is a big library. I've used it many times. Rabbi Munshine had worked there. There are many, Ezra Shavit works there and many others. It's also affiliated, it's not far from the university, so a lot of the university professors, including Professor Simcha Emanuel, amongst others. I believe there's another professor, Yachmiel Brody, and others. There's Chaim Zalman Dimitrovsky, I'm not sure if he's still alive. There are some other huge libraries. There's in Britain, there's what used to call the British Museum, now it's the British Library, which is somewhere in London, I believe. There's Oxford and Cambridge, which are also in England. There's others, but Paris has a few. In Italy, there's a few. Parma, Rome. What? And in Russia still has a huge library. There's the Ginsburg collection. There's obviously the Lubavitch collection, which doesn't really belong there, belongs in Lubavitch and it should be returned. Yes, there are quite a few. There's in Leiden that has the Yerushalmi, the manuscripts which they had printed the Yerushalmi, which was written by Rabbi Yechiel Ber Roifei, the author of the Tanya, of the older book that was known as Tanya prior to the Alter Rebbe's book being famous as Tanya.
So who has the original Yerushalmis? Which?
It's not the original that Rabbi Yochanan compiled. It's many copies, but it was written by a Rishon. His name is Rabbi Yechiel Ben Kasiel, who also wrote a very popular book, Tanya, which is based on the Shibbolei Aleket, and it was originally written around the Siddur, known as Minhag Avos. He didn't give it the name Tanya. Tanya was named Tanya after the first word. But
right.
But that's...
Which
so
library?
He also is a scribe of the Yerushalmi. That Yerushalmi is in Holland, in the University of Leiden.
Oh wow!
We even have imprints from the Venice print. When Venice printed some of it, the imprint went over it. Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Rabbi Keller. I just want to.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Besides books, are there any other items that are stored at the library that are like artifacts, like the Baal Shem Tov's Kiddush cup or something like that?
There are certain, I'm not sure, the Baal Shem Tov stick was brought. There were different artifacts, there were different sticks of different tzaddikim. There are different items that over the years were given as a present to the Rebbe's library, whether in the times of the Frierdiker Rebbe or in times of the Rebbe, and we have a whole bunch of those. We also have a special wooden ark that was made by Rabbi Yaakov Lipsker we have, obviously, one of the most valuable is in the Rebbe's room. It's the Rebbe Marash's table. The Rebbe Marash's table had belonged, I believe, to one of the Rebbe Marash's grandchildren, and she donated it to the Rebbe, I believe, in 5,708. I believe Yankel Lipsker brought it with him when he came from Paris. Not sure if it was one of Reb Mendel's kids. I think it was one of Reb Mendel's daughters that gave it to Reb Yankel Lipsker. Reb Mendel was another son of the Rebbe Marash, and I guess he had taken it out of Russia when he had left Russia or something.
Who had the best walking stick?
The Rebbe never walked with a stick. So we have a few of the walking sticks that in the collection, and my uncle wrote a book called Mi Base of Mikdash, which part of it describes the artifact. So anything you want to know about that, very interesting documents that there are, you can look up in Mi Base of Mikdash. And my uncle also wrote a series of historical information about Chabad in Israel, Chabad in Poland, Chabad in Lithuania. What's very interesting is the Tanya. Soon we're going to begin the Tanya again. Every year, Yudhishthira Kislev, we start the Tanya. In the introduction to the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says, saying to our country and Smuchos law, what's close to it. Our country obviously refers to White Russia specifically, which is where the Alter Rebbe lived, and which is, it seems, I read today somewhere that Smuchos law, the close place to it is certain parts of Lithuania, specifically Vilna and Vidz, which is where, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested, they arrested the Chassidim. What happened was, it seems that complaint was written by some person who resided in Vilna, and he wanted more than the Alter Rebbe bothered him, the Chassidim in Vilna, and the only pretext he could say is, well, they're following this nutty guy or rebel from, so that's why he was the Alter Rebbe. The difference between the two, we're going to mention now briefly the three arrests and liberations. Soon, Yudhishthira Kislev, we're going to be, today is Yud Aleph Kislev, in 8 days, exactly a week from tomorrow, we'll be celebrating all over the world the release of the Alter Rebbe from prison. They were not only after him, but after Chassidus. But initially, they didn't mention about all the Chassidim. They only mentioned him. It was in the second arrest that they filed a detailed complaint against the book of the Baal Shem Tov, Tzavas Rivash. But over here, it was specifically against the Alter Rebbe and his followers. And the Mittler Rebbe, it was specifically against the fact that the Mittler Rebbe, many Rebbes then were supported. How were they supported? You see, the Alter Rebbe made a fact that in addition to the meager salary that they gave him for being the Maggid of Liozna, which wasn't much to write home about, his wife had a grocery store, and he was even registered as a businessman, because he was also, one of the things he did, which he did not take money for, was that if different businessmen had arguments, financial arguments, they would come for him, not as a bezdin, but as an arbitrator, as a sole arbitrator. They would give him blank pieces of paper, in which he can write, whatever amount, we were talking about, and he can write it for this guy or for the other guy. So once the ruling was given, I didn't need the favor that he's going to follow that ruling. In advance, they were giving the blanks, and he would hold the blanks, and that's how he would. So he was registered. The first collection that started even in times of the Alter Rebbe was for all the guests that would come to hear the Alter Rebbe. So those who can afford would pay their own way. There were rich people who would host people, for money. As far as Shabbos and Yom Tov was concerned, they would host them for free. But during the week, the town of Liozna were poor people. They couldn't afford. So the Alter Rebbe made a collection from all the Hasidim. In addition to money that they gave for Eretz Yisrael, which we'll talk about some other time. I don't know if you have the time now. But it would be fascinating to talk about. The Alter Rebbe kept a cheshbon. He wanted that it's not just in general, okay, we're sending some money to, let's say, Avram Kalisker, who was then the leader of the Hasidim in Eretz Yisrael. No. But every single person, there were 30 families, every single family should know he's getting money from each person in each town. And each person in each town should know, how much are you giving for this family, how much are you giving for that family. Here and there, one person would say, it's very nice that we're getting money from you guys, but the money we're getting from you guys is not enough. And then you'd see from the next year, they all actually increase the amount for each and every one of these people. That's a fascinating story. We'll have to talk about that some other time.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Keller. Very, very, very interesting and enjoyable. And thank you for the Divrei Torah as well in the beginning. And Metz Hashem, definitely would love to have you again. Sei gesund, everyone. And thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. And hopefully we should see the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe and all the Rebbeim. We'll dance with them near Shalayim, Ira Kodesh, when Mashiach came.
Amen.
Amen.